Okay, now in order to understand some of the flaws in Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy, you do have to kind of go back and look at events that happened before we enter the war actively. And no event really kind of sums all that up better than the battle at Abak in 1963. So let's talk a little bit about that and some of the lessons that should have been learned at Abak and should have been factored into Westmoreland's decisions to embrace this search and destroy strategy, but unfortunately we're not. So Abak takes place actually in early 63. It starts actually a few days after Christmas in 1962. And it starts when the ARVN forces, as well as our advisors, remember this is 63, we're not actively fighting the war yet, we're just serving in the capacity of advisors. So we get intelligence that the Viet Cong have a large transmitter located near the villages of Ap Bak and Ap Tan Toi. Now if you look at your map, that would be located southwest of Saigon, about 40 miles southwest of Saigon, in an area known as the Mekong River Delta. That will be a problem for us, that Din Tong province, really throughout the war. It will continue to be really a hotbed of Viet Cong activity. And as we fast forward to 1968, which really is kind of the peak of the war, it will be a really hot flashpoint during something that is known as the Tet Offensive that we'll talk about later. So the particular Viet Cong position where this transmitter was located was surrounded. It was kind of a village that had two villages that had an irrigation ditch kind of running between them, heavy jungle tree lines, surrounded by very large open rice paddies. So the plan here, our intelligence tells us that about 120 Viet Cong are guarding this transmitter in this area. And the plan here is a classic deployment of that air cavalry strategy that we talked about before. So about 1,200 ARVN forces are going to attack what our intelligence tells us are about 120 Viet Cong at the village of Abak. They're going to be supported, obviously, by helicopters and helicopter gunships as they're dropped in that classic air cavalry strategy. And they're also going to be supported by armored personnel carriers that will be manned with ARVN troops. So before we talk about what happened at the actual battle, some intelligence failures are important to note because I think it's really helpful in having you understand why the strategy failed. So the first thing is that our intelligence, wasn't great. At Abak, the Viet Cong forces were 3 times as large, about 400 troops, than our intelligence told us. The other problem is the Viet Cong had really good espionage and ways of getting information from inside the ARVN. So the Viet Cong actually knew we were coming at Abak, which obviously doesn't help the situation any better. That caused them to really dig in. They built trenches and used the tree lines and really created a very easily fortifiable, defensible position. So here's the way it basically goes down. These 1,200 troops are dropped into the open rice paddies. Obviously, helicopters have to land out in the open. I think it's something like 10 helicopters actually do the drop-in, and then we have additional helicopter gunships that are there in support. Almost immediately when the helicopters land and the ARVN troops come out, they're under heavy fire from this defensible trench and tree line that you see in that picture there beyond the helicopter that's destroyed. So that creates a lot of problems. 14 out of the 15 helicopters are shot, 5 are destroyed. This not only results in ARVN forces coming under fire, but the pilots are American, and those Americans come under fire. Now, almost immediately, the American advisor that's in command of this particular attack, a general by the name of Van, orders the ARVN armored units to immediately advance to the site of where the helicopters are under fire to protect not only the ARVN troops, but also his American advisors as well. The ARVN armored units are very slow to advance, and the whole thing really just kind of falls apart very quickly. In the end, 80 ARVN forces are killed and 3 American advisors are killed. That night, eventually, the armored personnel carriers do move in and are able to kind of get whatever remaining troops are out safely, but it takes them literally hours to get to these sites where these helicopters are at the scene that you see in that picture there. So that night, the Viet Cong retreat, and U.S. advisors from Vietnam call back and call this a tremendous victory because we were able to make the Viet Cong forces retreat, and basically were able to then take control of that position. This is something that's going to hurt us throughout the war, is that we define these engagements with the Viet Cong by whether or not we take territory. And I mean, that is the classic definition of military victory. The problem is if the Viet Cong leave the battlefield and are able to gain popular support due to their performance and the fact that they challenged the ARVN forces and the Americans, and they are able still to fight another day, that military victory doesn't really result in political victory in the sense that even though the Vietnam were forced to retreat, the fact that they were able to inflict such casualties on the Americans against such superior technology helps them earn and gather more credibility with the people of South Vietnam. So once again, military victory doesn't always equal political victory. So some lessons learned at Abac that were missed was that good intelligence was hard to come by in Vietnam. We did our best, but a lot of times intelligence was less than perfect. We also should have learned that the Viet Cong had much better intelligence on our plans than we had anticipated. I think that this is something that would plague us throughout the war. We also saw here, or should have seen here at Abac, that the Viet Cong would stand and fight despite the fact that they were outnumbered and despite the fact that they were facing much superior technology. Air cavalry, we also should have learned here that while it was really a very innovative way to get troops to strategic locations quickly, and also, by the way, remove those troops quickly, it had its vulnerabilities. You could see at Abac, the fact that these landing zones, or LZs, as they'll become known throughout the war, are out in the open, and if Viet Cong are in defensive positions around those landing zones, it puts our troops in a very vulnerable situation. So I think Abac is definitely an example of something that happened before we were actively involved in the war that should have taught us a lot about why the search and destroy strategy probably would not be so effective. Another example of a lesson that should have been learned a couple years after Abac is the battle for the Nha Trang Valley in 1965. So this is a little different situation than Abac. Now we're in 65. This is after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So we are now actively fighting combat. So not just advisors to the ARVN forces. And this is really the first major engagement of U.S. combat forces in South Vietnam. It starts out in an area of Vietnam called Plei My, kind of in the northern central part of South Vietnam. When the North Vietnamese Army attacks one of our special forces camps at the village of Plei My, and this kind of makes us realize that there are North Vietnamese nearby, and it's an opportunity for us to use this air mobile strategy, but this time with our forces fighting, not the ARVN, and try to engage the NVA right away, and get a big victory early on in the war. So we insert 192 troops into the Nha Trang Valley, into an open area that will become known as LZ, or Landing Zone X-Ray. This is the fall of 1965. At that point, we're not, again, intelligence, once again, we're not exactly sure of the number of NVA forces. We think it's probably in the low hundreds. But once again, we're forced to land in an open field, surrounded by heavily kind of densely jungle area. And what we don't know is we drop it, as you can see by the map, the blue dots represent the U.S. forces, and the orange dots represent North Vietnamese forces. So what we don't know is we're dropping into a valley that is surrounded by 2,400 NVA soldiers. Now, most of those soldiers we can't see because they're underground. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong did an excellent job of creating underground infrastructure, everything from communications rooms to weapons depots, even hospitals that would enable them to kind of disappear after fighting. And in this situation, obviously make it difficult for us to even know that they were there. So we're surrounded. The fighting is very intense. Some of you may have seen the Mel Gibson film, We Were Soldiers. That film is completely about the Battle of Ia Drang Valley. So if you're interested in that, it's based on the book We Were Soldiers, which was actually written by a journalist that actually went along with the U.S. Air Cav unit in this situation and was trapped there for 3 days of fighting. So it's an interesting story hearing a journalist talk about what it's like to be kind of stuck in battle. But heavy fighting, as you can see by the slide, after 3 days of fighting, we lost 500 men, but inflicted 1,500 casualties on the NVA side. So once again, we're going to come out of this declaring this and thinking this is a victory, and thinking this is an example of an event that should reinforce Westmoreland's search and destroy strategy, to reinforce the idea that we can do this. We can use this air mobile strategy, use our intelligence to find out where the NVA and Viet Cong are, drop U.S. troops into the jungle, engage the enemy, and then let our air power and artillery take over. And as pretty much throughout the war, this strategy is successful in inflicting casualties on the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, frequently much higher than our own. But as we talked about before, military victory in this conflict doesn't always equal political victory.